So, do you need a COO? Let's start with a quick show of hands on, I know most of you are CEOs, so who's got a COO today? Okay, a couple. Anybody had the same COO for more than 2 years? All right. We've got some folks there. So I asked that question, of course, to get us started because the COO, in my experience, at least in consumer internet, I don't know if this is true in other industries, it's got a bit of a reputation as a widowmaker role. Everybody familiar with that? I think that's a Jim Collins thing. So widowmaker, kind of almost by definition, it's a role that tends not to last very long. And mine, strangely enough, has actually lasted, I think, somewhere in the 9-year range now. I joined Yelp in 2005, and somehow, strangely, still have the role of COO today. And so I often get this question of do you need a COO? And if so, what is that person actually supposed to do? It's a good question. I'm still trying to answer it. On the way up, I was trying to think of in popular culture and other kind of COO type characters who you might, think of in your mind as this person who might complement and help a CEO. And obviously, we're all familiar with the model of Cheryl at Facebook, which has been, tremendously successful and added a ton of value for Facebook. But in popular culture, I couldn't really come up with a lot of great examples. There's, for Godfather fans, there's Tom Hagen, but, maybe with no violence. Now, if you watch Silicon Valley, there's this Jared figure, but, maybe tone down the awkwardness a little. And then, for West Wing fans, there was Leo, the chief of staff, who was pretty awesome, but then, you'd like to tone down the drinking problems as well. So these are, kind of flawed figures. So I guess they're all human, or supposed to be human. I think ultimately, though, all of those characters, have one thing in common, and that is they exist to complement and strengthen the CEO. That's the whole job. And that is why I think COO is a role that tends to be so generally poorly understood and very differently defined at every company, right? Because I think when done well, that's the whole thing it is what is it that the CEO maybe, has blind spots in, areas that aren't his or her power alley, and wants to be complemented with. That's mainly the job. And as a result, I think you see that role take pretty different shape at different companies. I guess let's do a little bit of way back, and I'll tell you kind of my story, and then we can talk more about how I've seen this exist at other places as well. So as Keith mentioned, we worked together at a web startup back in the late 90s. I worked on a couple of startups back then. Ended up at eBay for about 5 years, where I briefly overlapped with Alex. And eBay was great as a training ground, as I think Alex touched on, for marketing and general management-y, category management-y kind of skills. Jeremy, our CEO and founder, when he was starting Yelp, was 27 years old. He had briefly been head of engineering at PayPal. So as those two facts suggest, he was heavy on youth and ambition and also tech, right? So he was our sort of product and engineering visionary. And about a year into it, as he actually started to get some real success with the early days of Yelp, and was out raising his first real money to try to take this next level, I think Keith and other sort of friends of the family suggested, hey, it might be a good idea to try to go out and find somebody who's been around the block maybe a little bit more than you have in business. And I was lucky enough to be introduced to Jeremy through Keith. Jeremy also met a bunch of different folks at the time. He did not want to hire a COO, by the way. It was not ever called a COO, but rather, called it different things, head of business development and some other things. I ultimately ended up taking the job of VP of business development, which we joke today is funny on 2 counts. One, I was the 10th employee, and no 10-person company has any business with VPs as far as I'm concerned, so that's kind of silly in and of itself. And then business development was funny because we didn't actually ever do any business development. But why did I get the job? I sort of look back on that, and I suspect that I got the job because I was the closest thing Jeremy could handle to adult supervision at the time. And we'll come back to this theme in a moment. But so I was 32. I had done business-oriented things for about 10 years at that point. And so I had a couple years on him, and I had some business experience relative to his more product and tech-oriented experience. And I think that fit actually served us pretty well. Within a couple of weeks of getting to the company, I found myself, editing the site and email newsletters. We had a junior guy who was beginning to start to call local businesses, seeing if they wanted to buy advertising. So I helped him get a Salesforce account set up and develop a script and figured out, well, how should we start trying to price these things? I built the company's first budget and financial model because it seemed like a good idea to have one if we were going to, bring in a bunch of money and begin to spend it and hire people. Over time, basically the role that evolved was one in which Jeremy continued to focus on product and engineering, and of course setting the vision for the whole company. And then I sort of filled in and led in areas like sales and marketing and finance and HR and the company building parts of the equation. I think, so I guess to set a little context for those who may not be familiar with Yelp, I started as the 10th employee, and then today we're about 3,200. So of course, lots has evolved and changed, including my role over that time period. But what I'd say in terms of like what we do day to day is that in many ways it hasn't changed all that much. I think of my role today in kind of three parts. The first is sort of the administrative component, which is kind of the keeping the trains running stuff. It's approving budgets and meeting with folks and making sure that projects are getting done on time and such. The second is sort of the communication piece. And this is where I think of this as sort of translating, working with Jeremy to crystallize his vision and then translating that into communication for the rest of the company. And while that was important when we were small, everybody was sat next to Jeremy, so they kind of knew what he was thinking all the time. And so as the organization has scaled, taking that role of doing things like hosting the all hands meetings, running our exec staff meeting every week, at the end of every year coming up with like, okay, what are the big themes of this next year going to be and how are we going to crystallize those and get them out to the company? How does that translate into sort of budget setting and priorities and whatnot, kind of playing that piece of the role. So communication and vision crystallization is kind of the second piece. And then the third piece has actually always been special projects. I've always sort of had, and I think I encourage all of our managers in the company to have this, but set aside at least a third of your time to work on something that's almost an individual contributor project of your own. Most recently, I helped develop our ads, our first kind of TV and print ads that we're running as a campaign for that. And of course, part of that comes with now hiring somebody to do it better than I could do it myself. Previously, I saw a need for management training, so about this time last year, we rolled out a management training program. Somebody had to do it. We didn't have somebody on staff because the role didn't exist yet, and so I just sort of picked those things up. And I do find that having those individual contributor projects always tends to kind of keep me fresh and a little more grounded, rather than just sort of being a bureaucrat or trains running on time guy. So, how does this all manifest itself? I think a couple things. One is, in the nicest definition, Jeremy, at one point when I think he was feeling particularly generous, described me as the glue that held the company together. I think that's probably an over-generous description, but I think when it works well, that's where a COO role can be particularly helpful, right? Is that it can feel a little bit like the benefit of having a two-parent household. The con, as you can imagine where that's going, is the same thing. You create a mom and dad phenomenon. I think the title in and of itself does carry a lot of weight, and it carries a lot of weight internally as much as externally, right? And so that can create a phenomenon where accidentally people will read into my body language or Jeremy's body language and go running off in a direction thinking that like, oh, mom or dad approved this, when in fact they didn't check with the right person. And so creating really clear lines of communication and authority has been important along the way. I guess recent examples in sort of the good and the bad case. In the good case, and I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, I think if there's sort of one thing that's been most true along the way, it's CEO's a lonely job. My guess is that I'm preaching to the choir on that, but it is, right? It's a very lonely job, and I think it's been helpful, observing this close up, for Jeremy to have the person that he can have the hallway conversation with after, who has less of a bone to pick or less internal competition than everybody else. And I think what's enabled it to be particularly successful in our case is because we've been together for so long and we've been doing this thing for so long, we sort of both know each other's ins and outs, and he knows, hopefully, that he can trust me. As we sort of get into recommendations for a moment, that'll kind of go the other way. I guess, back to recent examples. So a couple of weeks ago, we had our earnings announcement, and we got beat up we missed our expectations by a little bit, and we definitely got beat up in the stock and the press. And that, of course, creates a host of questions that you end up getting from reporters, investors, and employees. And I think it's been very helpful for Jeremy to both have a confidant in that time period when things are rough, but also to actually have a second voice, mostly inside the company, but outside the company too, right? Having a second voice who's actually on the same page as the CEO can be very helpful in kind of reassuring everybody that it's not just one person and this person's not off the reservation, right? There's actually a team and we're thinking through this together and we're actually holding hands and we're all on the same page. So I think these are times when having that second person can be pretty helpful. I think, we already talked about the sometimes downsides of having a second person as well. And, you do create this mom and dad dynamic of people kind of know who's going to be more soft on a particular issue, and they'll figure that out. And so if you don't create real clear lines of communication and authority, folks will sort of figure out, if I ask Jeremy about this, I'll probably get my project approved. Or if I ask Geoff about this one, I'll get my project approved. And so you have to, of course, make sure that, people are not able to do end runs. So should you have a CEO or a COO, sorry. I think, the answer there is probably, and you're probably getting this, is kind of like yes and no. My guess is if you don't already have this person that does many of the roles that we talked about with my both joke kind of fictional characters as well as in the real world, it might be really helpful to have one or two people who play those roles. Do you need somebody who's called COO? I don't know. So what advice would I have for you? And I've been asked this question by a couple of you in the room, in fact. What advice would I have if you were to go out and look for a COO? There's a couple things. Let's start for a moment with the premise that you actually want to hire somebody with that title. I'm not sure that's necessary, and we'll jump to a different solution in a moment. But if you were going to hire somebody with that title, what are some things I would look for? First off, I would look for skill sets that your company needs and aren't your own personal power alleys. My guess is everybody in this room has already had the fun of trying to hire somebody who's just like you. It tends not to work very well, right? Because you're always going to think you're better at whatever it is than the person who's just like you. So I would try to find some area of the business that is important, but isn't your own power alley and it's not your own baby, that you're able to really hand off. As a related point, I would make sure, back to that lines of authority and communication, that you clarify, what is a person's sandbox going to be. Right? So, and be really focused on that. Not trying to hire somebody out of central casting who can be COO, but what's the right COO for your company? Right? The second piece is personal fit. I would think long and hard, or take a long, hard look in the mirror at what is it that you actually want and value in somebody who's going to be your confidant and second communicator for the company, right? In Jeremy's case, back to, I jokingly said I think I was the closest thing he could handle to adult supervision, right? At 32, I had a few years on him, but I wasn't the person who was going to come in and start telling him what to do or run a power grab on him, right? Here's a little minor segue, but we were hiring our first VP of engineering, or VP sales, sorry. And Keith will remember this. This was probably early 2007, and we had a 7-person sales team. And so we needed to hire somebody who was going to take our 7-person sales team, hopefully grow it to 20, and then maybe 50, right? One of our board members, who will remain nameless, was selling us really hard to hire Tim Armstrong. Now, Tim Armstrong, who you probably know today is famous for being CEO of AOL, was then the SVP of global sales at Google. His team was approximately 10,000 people, and he had already made more money than God. So, while I believe that he could run a 7-person sales team, the idea of hiring Tim Armstrong at that time, who had this 10,000-person team, to kind of come run a 7-person sales team at Yelp and take it to 20 seemed like crazy talk. Unfortunately, we were able to sort of get through that and hire somebody who was, had been a little bit more than 7, right? The person who we actually hired, Jed Nachman, still with us today. He had actually run a 50-person sales team at Yahoo. So he was a little ahead of where we already were, but not like 20 miles ahead of where we already were. I would encourage you to do the same thing. I've often, when I've seen folks make a mistake with the COO hire, oftentimes it's, trying to hire that superstar out of central casting who's already had the 10,000-person team. That may or may not be the person you really want. And then last thing, so we're, skill sets, what do you really want? And my last piece of recommendation on the, what should you look for is, what does this person really want? What are their motivations? Do they actually want to be COO of your company? Or is this a stepping stone to CEO of your company or somebody else's company? Again, when I've seen these things not work out, I think it's oftentimes can be attributed to that third bucket. Many of the people I know who want a COO role, they really like the allure of it. It sounds great, right? It sounds like a stepping stone to be a CEO. The problem is if you find that person, my guess is that they'll be fairly short-lived with you because they're going to spend most of the time either subconsciously, even if they're well-intended, gunning for your role, or trying to get to be great friends with all of your investors so they can set themselves up for the role after that, right? So finding somebody who's really got the right motivations. So this is going to then get me into my tactical recommendation that some of you I know, again, have heard. But that is, if you decided you wanted some of these things that were a COO, right? But maybe you don't want to go through the risk that it puts your company through to hire somebody and call them COO out the gate. Maybe there's an opportunity to take people who might already be on your staff, or perhaps you can hire in and create 2 or even 3 roles that are senior confidant roles to you, right? Could there be a VP or SVP of operations? Could there be a VP or SVP of sales and marketing? Could there be somebody who oversees product and engineering? Making things up, obviously. But if you can bring people in like that, give them direct accountability for one area of the business, and again, I know you probably have some of these in your company today, and get to build up that level of trust and respect and accountability with them over a period of years, maybe at some point, 6, 12, 18 months from now, it makes sense to give them the COO role, at which point the company, the rest of the company, will say, hey, that makes sense. We already know this person. And it's already clear where that person's power alleys are, and they've gotten used to your leadership as CEO. So that's pretty much what I have on the package, should you get a COO side of things. I hope there's something slightly new in there, and wish you guys all well with the adventure of finding that partner if you want one. Happy to take any questions or suggestions at this point. Talk about anything else you guys want.
Yeah, I'm sure some people have questions. I see one over there, HackerRank.
Yeah.
That's all. So one of the challenges with sort of these layered roles that are across different functional areas of the company is it really becomes, as you mentioned, accountability becomes kind of hard to define.
Right.
What is this person actually accountable for, and are they accountable for anything, or are they simply supporting? And do you have examples of how people have navigated that boundary, and are they explicit about it? Is it just implicit? Like how do you structure that?
Yeah, thanks for that question. In fact, one of the things I meant to point out is I am a big believer. Org charts matter. They're annoying, and nobody really likes to draw them up, but I do think they matter. Organizations inevitably are going to look for like who's in charge of what, and I think it's really important to have a COO. I am not a believer in the I formation. Are you familiar with that line? So that's the CEO's on top, and then you have a COO who's really like manages everybody. I'm not a believer in that structure. I think that's silliness. I think it's a much better approach to make the COO specifically in charge of, or whoever it is, these kind of layered roles, specifically in charge of a few departments. And then I think it's easier to have accountability across those specific departments. So as an example, sales and marketing each have their own targets, and if you have somebody who's in charge of sales and marketing, well, then their job is to make sure sales and marketing both hit their individual targets. So I think that's the easiest way to handle it. Ultimately, in my specific case, as my role has gotten pretty broad over the years, it is really hard to tease apart like what should Jeremy be held accountable for and what should I be held accountable for. So admittedly, that would be a trick, and ultimately, if one of us is in trouble, probably both of us are in trouble. So that could cut both ways.
Vivek, over there, right there.
Hi, I'm Vivek. I'm the CEO of HackerRank. We are actually trying to recruit a COO, and it's a pretty tough experience. So one thing that I had 2 questions. One is how close of a skill set that you should try and optimize for, which means like sales is pretty broad. I mean, the enterprise sales guy from Salesforce who heads is very different from Yelp or Google, but it's still sales. So how close of a skill set that you should actually go ahead and match? And second, you want the COO to be somebody who can be a partner to sort of like dominate the world. I mean, that's the thing for every company. And so the fact that you're not ambitious enough to be a CEO in the future, it's a fine line. Like, are you ambitious, or are you like, goal oriented for me to like dominate the world with you or not? How do you draw the line for both of these?
I love those questions, especially the second one. I'm going to take the second one first because it's so fascinating. I think there's different kinds of ambition in the world, right? There's ambition to do great things, and there's ambition for the company or the project or the team, and there's personal ambition. And I think it's sometimes pretty hard to tease those apart. But if you can hire for ambition for team, right? And this comes out in lots of little ways in conversation and what you see on people's resume and whatnot, right? If you can hire for ambition for the team and the project, or I want my team to be successful and my team to win, versus the, hey, I hit 3 home runs, but my team lost, kind of a personality, which, often comes out as well, that might get you in the right direction of that person who does want to conquer the world with you, but doesn't need to, stomp on everybody else to get there. By the way, it actually reminds me of a great blog post that I think Ben Horowitz wrote at one point called Peacetime CEO, Wartime CEO. You guys read that? I'm seeing a bunch of nodding heads in here. I love that. It's a great post. Fascinatingly enough, I think it's only a few years old. When I read that, I was thinking, gosh, Yelp actually kind of has that. And certainly I'm no CEO, but in a lot of ways, from a personality perspective, Jeremy's the wartime CEO. He loves the next battle. Like, that's always what he's looking for, is like the next battle, and he's in the middle of it and whatnot. And I'm more the like, hey, give me a stable situation and let me take it to the next level. I want to take 1 to 5 and 5 to 10 and so on. And I think from a personality perspective, that happens to have worked out pretty well for us because, businesses do go through peacetime and wartime and whatnot. So, and now I'm not remembering your other question. You asked the first question. Sorry. Oh, skill set match. Well, yes, you always ideally want to get it to be as close a match as you possibly can. Specific to sales, I would tell you that the kind of sales that we mostly do to local businesses, as an example, and versus enterprise sales, like I'm selling $1 million accounts or airplanes or these type of things. Massively different skill set. Other than they were probably both really popular in high school, that's probably about where it ends. Because the kind of sales that we do at Yelp, for the most part, the 80% of our business, that's a people, numbers, bodies job of how are you going to motivate a team of 50 and then 100 and then 1,000, people kind of out there in the world, frankly, doing a lot of dialing for dollars, versus hey, we pay people $300,000 a year and we never see them at the office because they're just taking Boeing out to lunch. And I know I totally simplified that enterprise sales world, but it's, that's a very, very different kind of an animal. So yeah, sorry about that.
Question, Richard?
You mentioned that the second piece was a communication piece, translating the vision.
Yeah.
What have you found to be effective communication strategies, some of the experiments, some things that have really worked?
Yeah. What we find, I guess, more than anything else, is that our needs keep changing. They change for a variety of different reasons, but inevitably the company evolves, right? And so, in our particular cases, what was once a bunch of people sitting next to each other became people sitting on multiple floors that didn't sit next to each other, became people sitting in different offices, and the needs of the business and everything else have sort of changed with it. So I think more than anything, what we found is we have to just keep iterating on the ways in which we communicate. My favorite recent tactic that we've rolled out as a communication channel is a video blog. And it's actually not just one anymore, but the short of it is we call it the Stopple blog. And Jeremy shoots a 2 to 3 minute video about once a week that he then sends out to the entire company with, hey, here's what I'm doing this week, here's what's on my mind, here's what's going on. It's provided a really helpful forum for us to be able to communicate what are you reading in the news, what's the hot new project, what conference is Jeremy at, just whatever it is to kind of keep people, getting to know their leader and leaders, as well as, fresh and a channel to communicate through when things are tougher. So that's actually been a really helpful tactic. I would say, if you're not already remote and you don't already have hundreds of people, that particular tactic might not be useful, but that has been a recent tactic that we found pretty helpful. Sadly, one other thing I found in terms of communication channels is there is no communication channel today that I have that probably gets more than a 50% participation rate. So, that old adage about you have to kind of keep saying things over and over and over, I find it to be totally true, and it's probably been true since we were 50 people. And you can throw an all hands meeting and you can get everybody to physically show up, but if you go around and ask people, did they hear the 4 things that you actually wanted them to hear? Half of them didn't hear it. I don't know why. Maybe they're on their phone. Maybe they're just tuned out that day. I don't know why. But finding different ways to say the same thing is really important if you want people to hear a message. So.
Ethan up front.
Yeah.
So I have a question about Yelp kind of being in play and on the auction block, and I won't ask you what's happening, but I will ask how do you keep your teams focused? You talked about communication and that being very important. I would imagine that something like that is very disruptive and could grind everything to a halt. So what do you sort of see as your role as the COO during this process?
Yeah. So first, I will sort of acknowledge I can't comment on rumor or speculation. Let's go to kind of past tense of certainly there have been rumors and speculation about us in the past, and almost every 6 months this kind of thing happens, and it often is very disruptive. You definitely get people jumping to crazy conclusions really fast. And my analogy of the day is we may all believe in global warming, but are you going to sell your house in San Francisco and move to Denver tomorrow? Probably not, right? I mean, it's, we can give it a little time. And so we had some funny examples of new recruits emailing HR to say, should I still show up for work on Monday, or are you guys closing? What? I mean, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves here, folks. So yes, certainly in tumultuous times or anytime there's kind of rumors or whatnot, mostly I find my job to be, and I think Jeremy feels the same thing, is calm confidence and continue to move ahead. Obviously, to the extent that there are rumors, then you have to do your best to be able to tell people what you can tell them, which unfortunately sometimes as a public company is you can't tell them that much. But what you can say is hey, almost what I just said to you is let's look at past tense. Right? Well, past tense, what I could tell you is one of the guys who's had a vote on these type of things is if, and when we were ever looking at deals in the past, what we were thinking about was what would be good for the company as a whole? What would be good for our ecosystem of users? What would be good for our employees? What would be good for our shareholders, right? And of course, we would only want to sell to a partner who's going to be net good for everybody. So these, wild ideas of are we going to just shut down is crazy talk, because it's hard to imagine a scenario. I can't promise that an asteroid won't hit the Earth tomorrow, right? But I could say that it'd be hard for me to imagine voting on such a thing. So it's kind of the best we can do.
Question right there.
Hey Geoff, I have 2 questions.
Yeah.
And the first is, and I actually mean this seriously, did you ever play organized team sports and ever seriously? And the second, and I'm just wondering if that's a part of your past. And then secondly, can you talk a little bit about your actual recruitment into Yelp? So how did, maybe Jeremy got lucky, maybe Keith knew you, so it was short-circuited, but how did he kind of gauge a lot of that stuff? How did you figure out if you wanted to be a part of that team in this role?
Yeah. Fascinated by the team sports question. But the short answer is kinda on team sports. So I played Little League as a little kid, but I was never good. And I played soccer and some other things. But again, I was never good. I got into fencing in high school, which is definitionally an individual sport. And I got to be pretty good at that. And I stuck with that for a while. So there are technically fencing teams, and I was on the fencing team in college, but it's more like tennis is a team sport, right? Which is, So there's a team sport answer. But I am a big believer in team sports, and team sport metaphors are wonderful for business, as I'm sure you all know. So I stick with them all the time. As to the question about my recruitment, on the Jeremy side, I think it really was as simple as Keith told him he should have lunch with me, and so we did. But I think Jeremy probably did meet, a dozen other people, and they probably ranged from, and my guess again is really it probably did come down to, I was actually into his product. And so I guess, this is a little of the both sides. The first time Keith sent me Yelp, there was a bunch of stuff going on at that time that was sort of Web 2.0, and I think of a lot of Web 2.0 as product masquerading as company, or feature masquerading as company in some cases. And so a lot of these things I would see would be like, oh, that's neat, but I don't really see how it's going to be a successful company. Whereas, when I got to playing with Yelp, I both got it as from a consumer perspective, and then also sort of saw, hey, if these guys could pull it off, I don't see why they won't disrupt the Yellow Pages, right? And so that's pretty compelling from a business perspective. So I think, genuinely from Jeremy's perspective, it was, hey, here's a guy who's really into my product, has been around the block a little bit more than me, and seems like genuinely ambitious from a team perspective. And it was probably kind of that simple. And from my side, it was, I thought these guys were onto something. They had a product that made a lot of sense. And both Russ, who was the other co-founder who I haven't really mentioned today, but both Russ and Jeremy were just really compelling young guys. Like, they also felt ambitious for the team, but not for self. They had been sort of from a career perspective in this sweet spot, like a lot of the PayPal mafia, of they had made a little money, so they actually weren't in it for money. They were in it to do something cool and change the world. And I found that very compelling, and we sort of hit it off. So it's a very squishy answer, but ultimately that was kind of it.
Cool. We have time for one more question. Sure, in the back. Right there.
So how do you and Jeremy communicate? Do you have a fixed time every day? Do you sit next to each other? Is it just ad hoc? How do you two stay in sync?
Yeah. We no longer sit next to each other. We did for the first few years, but we haven't for years now. And we do have a scheduled one-on-one for an hour every week, and we'll usually go for a walk or we'll go out to lunch or something like that. And that's kind of the parking lot to talk about all the stuff that comes up during the course of the week. But then we also organize the way that we make decisions in the company we have a lot of what we call kind of SWAT team or cross-functional teams set up, where usually on a Monday, we've actually sort of taken a page out of the VC playbook a little bit, where Monday tends to be our like cross-functional team meeting day. And so we'll spend almost the entire day together on Mondays, where we're kind of going from one group to the next, checking in on a variety of the projects that we care most about at the moment. And then we'll have some of those that'll sort of inevitably trickle in through the week. So my guess is on a given week, we'll probably spend 8 to 10 hours together, but only maybe an hour or so of that would be, individual. And then of course, we're both sort of on IM and texting each other as kind of stuff's going on during the day.
Great. Geoff, thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.